the early part of 1941, the Philippine Islands were thought to be one of the safest places in the world to be. Few people ever thought that the war would ever reach the islands. In December 1941, war clouds hung heavily over the islands. 2 weeks after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese invaded the Philippines. On January 2, 1942, the Japanese military order was sent out for all American and Allied civilians to surrender to the Japanese authorities. Over 6,000 American and Allied civilians were captured and taken to civilian prisoner of war camps, where they spent the next 37 months. They were crowded into Santo Tomas and Los Baños University campuses. These camps became organized cities of internees. Life continued as best as could be done under the severe and crowded conditions. Food was in short supply from the beginning and was a main concern for everyone. The Japanese military provided very little for their captives. If it had not been for the loyalness and generosity of the Filipino people, bringing food and supplies to the internees, many would have starved. On February 3, 1945, an American plane flew over Santo Tomas camp, dropping a pilot's goggle case with a note that read, "Roll out the barrel, there's going to be a hot time in the old town tonight." After crashing through the main gates of Santo Tomas, the two American tanks, the Georgia Peach and the Battling Basics, made their way to the main building with combat soldiers following behind them. The camp was shelled for several days by the Japanese soldiers on the outside of the camp. Many internees lost their lives after the liberation due to the shelling. On February 23, 1945, the 11th Airborne Paratroopers made a daring rescue of the civilian prisoners from the internment camp at Los Baños, freeing over 800 internees from death by starvation. The following are some of their stories.
But a close friend of mine had his father in the camp. This man, Johnny Harris, was not in the camp. He was an American mestizo. His father, however, was in the camp. His mother was Filipino, and these people were generally not interned. He had a radio receiver concealed in a closet in his house, and daily made transcripts of the KGEI broadcasts and passed them around to his friends. 3 times a week he met the drug buyers, or that is more properly medicine buyers, from Santo Tomas. These men, Stu Barnett, and 2 others, who in peacetime were actually representatives of large American drug houses in Manila. They were allowed to go out 3 times a week to purchase medicines and medical supplies, and would meet Johnny and exchange fountain pens. Well, for the young people today, we don't realize it, but a fountain pen in those days was rather large diameter and had a rubber, flexible rubber capsule inside, which you could easily remove. And it would take considerable amount of onion skin paper. So Johnny would type up his transcripts on onion skin, put it in a fountain pen, and meet the drug dealers and exchange fountain pens, which they brought into camp, read themselves, and gave to Johnny's father, who was a friend of mine. Anyway, his father was, Johnny was caught, his father was involved, and the 3 drug dealers were brought out of the camp. when Johnny's father was tortured, he brought my name into the picture. So I was taken out and interrogated due to the most fortunate circumstances of being interrogated in a dungeon of Fort Santiago next to another dungeon where the old man's previous testimony was being reviewed by an interpreter. I was able to overhear while being interrogated myself with and acquired therefore the knowledge of exactly what they had against me, which was simply supposed to be passing around transcripts. The crux of the story was that in the previous year I had been repairing radios belonging to the Japanese staff and guards, repairing them in the camp, turned over to me by the camp electricians. Mr. Harris, the senior, had given him rather close descriptions of the transcripts which I had supposedly shown him, and into such details as the color of the onion skin paper and the dates that I had shown these to him. This was a complete fabrication. I never had shown any transcripts to the old man. It was the other way around. But the important thing was that I knew the dates and the descriptions of the paper that was supposed to have been used. Having a lot of time sitting in the cell before my specific interrogation began, I could think back, and the incredible thing, an unbelievable thing, was that the dates given by the old man fell within a period in every case, and there were several different periods involved, within the time that I was repairing a radio for the Japanese. Fortunately, the old man did not say they were KGEI transcripts, only that they were radio broadcast transcripts. At that time, it was a death penalty for listening to shortwave radio. But the other fortunate thing for me was that there was a 50 kilowatt broadcast band station in Chongqing in Free China, and this station could be received in Manila on some days when propagation was good, so that I was able to tell the Japanese interrogator that that is what I had received, and that it was done while I was repairing these radios. They went to the camp and took out for a couple of days the camp electricians with whom I had fixed the radios for, and since everything jibed, they didn't really have much on me. And so after some months in Fort Santiago, I was brought to Bilibid, which was a sort of a holding place for those judged guilty but not yet court-martialed. So I spent 3.5 months in Bilibid. This was not the same portion of Bilibid where the American war prisoners was held, but it was a place on the eastern side where the guerrillas, and other political types of prisoners were held before court-martial. I was then court-martialed on June 30th, 1944 in Fort McKinley, now known as Fort Bonifacio, and on July 5th, 1944, sent to Muntinlupa and segregated there in one of two buildings set aside for political prisoners. I received a sentence of 3 years for hearing propaganda. My interpreter in the court-martials was a Nisei by the name of Richard Sakakida, who fortunately I had known before the war, although I did not know his true status. But his true status was that he was a sergeant in G2 operating undercover here in the Philippines, keeping an eye on the Japanese activities. I won't go into any more detail about Richard. That is another story and a very interesting one. I understand that there were 3 in his situation here, and he is the only survivor. Muntinlupa, up until September 8th, 1944, was a good place to be. At that particular time, it was better off than Santo Tomas because I could contact friends outside through the Filipino staff. We were allowed the freedom of the grounds and could congregate and talk together and make use of the hospital facilities and other things. Unfortunately, the last day of August, a number of these political prisoners escaped, including Raul Manglapos, our current Foreign Affairs Minister of our government. And while Raul and others of the group, who were my friends, wanted me to come along, I dared not do it since I had seen at Fort Santiago what happened to the wife and 6-month-old child of a guerrilla who had escaped and not been able to warn his family to hide. And I certainly could not decide to escape with my family, one member, either sister, mother, and father, in one of 3 various camps, that is Los Baños, Santo Tomas, and Cabanatuan. So I had to make the hard choice to stay. After that date in September, the Japanese came in and put in their own garrison, and we were now locked up all the time for the rest of the period and confined to those buildings. Conditions became very serious, worse than that same period in Santo Tomas, because of our 1,200 inmates, political prisoners, of course, only 400 survived due to extreme and improper nutrition. The only thing we really got to eat was kamoting kahoy chips with a tiny bit of rotten dried fish or shrimp thrown in for flavor. If you are familiar with this, basically it's the same material from which tapioca is made. And you boil these chips, it becomes like glue. And of all the various forms of starch, it is the one that is purest starch. Consequently, it's a deadly diet if you don't supplement it. The greatest killer in that period was beriberi, vitamin B deficiency. And it was really a terrible thing. I was able to survive without beriberi because I had the help of a Filipino fellow prisoner who, like myself, was a radio man, and one of the prison guards was his, prison guard was his townmate. And there was another insular prisoner who was a townmate, and they were able to smuggle some food into our building for us. So I survived and didn't fall sick of beriberi, which fell so many others. We were finally released in February 5th, made our way to Nasugbu, helped by guerrillas, because there was no way to get into Manila since the fighting was going on in the southern part of the city. Finally got back to Santo Tomas by the end of February. Okay.
Action. Okay.
We should say something about the package line and the various means of communications with people on the outside. Early in the period of the camp, the Japanese authorities allowed a limited number, actually only 4, to open fresh fruit and vegetable stalls inside the camp. At the same time, they did allow the friends and relatives and employees of the camp inmates to bring packages which were brought in through the main gate and on a long line of tables were inspected and turned over to the internees after the people who brought the packages had left. They were not allowed, the inmates were not allowed to talk to these outsiders. Of course, nearly everyone found ways to communicate by letter because it was worked out that the packages, together with containers, because a lot of the food was sent in jars and bottles and so on, which even the Japanese were reasonable enough to see had to be returned because there wasn't much of this kind of thing around as time went on. So people found ways to communicate through hidden notes and so on. In my own case, since I started the candy business, I needed more materials, sacks of sugar and so on. And so through one of the vegetable vendors whom I had befriended, got in touch with a former employee, a pre-war employee, who lived near Santo Tomas, and his family, brothers, father, mother, and so on, lived together. And I asked, through a note sent through this vendor, asked them to help me to do the buying. My sugar. They even found a barrel of cocoa, which I use for making chocolate candies. They bought me the necessary essential oils, flavoring extracts, and other things such as food coloring and so on. These materials were, of course, essential in making different kinds of candy. Also, sent in almost daily was raw peanuts and charcoal for my stove on which I cooked these things. They also obtained tools, instruments, pans for pouring out the candy. One of the things I had to learn very early was to make invert sugar. It's essential in nearly all candy making to give the proper chewing and eating qualities. Invert sugar can be made from regular sugar by boiling with citric or tartaric acid. Since these were not available in quantity, I took the next best means, which was to use calamansi juice. Calamansi juice has a very high citric acid content. As a result of this, it further occurred to me that the calamansi juice, if brought to a boil with sugar, would make a very good syrup. And using the flavorings and essential oils and coloring that I had, I was able to turn out orange juice, strawberry juice, etc., etc., in a very palatable form, and that while it was not orange or strawberry, it had exactly the same benefits. A friend of mine, Dick Hoey, who still lives nearby, sold this at night, together with cooling it, mixing it with water and cooling it with ice that came from my refrigerator, which was in Jerry Sam's hideaway. This package line went on until about the middle of February, and then the Japanese cut it off. The people who were involved in any kind of a business in the camp which needed outside supplies were of course all out of luck to continue. I myself didn't have to have that concern because I got into more serious trouble with the Kempi tie, as I said earlier, and was taken out on February 29th. One of the forms of communications that was done by camp members was by physically being able to view the person on the outside. And since there were a number of Americans in the camp and other Allied nationals who were married to Filipinas or neutral nations members, some of these people were able to rent apartments near the camp, on the roads around the camp. There were 2- and 3-story buildings, so it would be easy to see the upper floors of these places. Of course, signaling to them was a little risky because the Japanese, while the Japanese in the camp could often not see the inmate who was signaling, Japanese on roads outside could. So expedients had to be generated. One fellow I knew, who was a civilian worker in Nichols airfield, had a Filipino wife who visited a friend in an apartment just outside the campgrounds. used to go on the back balcony of the education building and do his daily exercise on this balcony. At the time, he could see his wife in this nearby building, and they worked out an elaborate code so that it was something like semaphore code, which, although he didn't know it, that is the semaphore code, he did easily work out a method of signaling his thoughts and needs to his wife. One way or the other, there were dozens of people involved in this sort of communication. And it was common knowledge to all of us. Very often, that way they had the latest news. Aside from note sending, there were also a number of ways of sending verbal information by people who, neutrals or Filipinos, who had to come into the camp. For example, some of the administrators of Santo Tomas University. Also, there were some medical people that were allowed to come in and help in the hospital. This this means of communication, of course, was often a great morale builder for those inside. Teenagers who would suddenly, young girls, get desperate because having boyfriends and having been a little more active than they should have been, and would suddenly lose their menstrual period, would become very upset. But when consulting a doctor, such as Dr. Fletcher, would find out that it was simply a matter of malnutrition. And that was a well-known thing in the camp.
So tell me a little bit about Dr. Fletcher. What was his job? What
Yes. Dr. Fletcher was the head medical officer of St. Luke's Hospital. St. Luke's Hospital was run by the Anglican Church of the United States. I think that's the Episcopal Church. And was a very hard-working doctor. As a matter of fact, he was our family doctor before the war. The work that he had to do in the camp was exhausting. It was just about one of the busiest persons there was. There was actually, of course, an insufficient number of doctors, so they were overworked. He was a short, person with a regular build. He had his wife and son in the camp. His son was much bigger. I think his name was Buzz, or a nickname anyway. And one thing that may show up in any records of the camp medical activities is that there might be some confusion, because there was a second Dr. Fletcher who was not related to Dr. Fletcher, and he was Filipino. And I believe he was from St. Luke's and had been allowed to come in and serve in the hospital camp for quite a long period of time. He was much taller than our camp Dr. Fletcher, and he also worked very hard. And if I am not mistaken, did continue working at St. Luke's after the war. St. Luke's was located in the boundary between Santa Cruz and Tondo in Manila. And after several years after the war, they built a far larger hospital on large grounds in Quezon City, and has taken the lead in recent years in installing the latest type of electronic equipment for hospital diagnosis and observation of patients. But in those days, it was also quite progressive and much respected. And Dr. Fletcher himself was, to a good extent, responsible for this reputation. When Dave Harvey came to Manila, one of the workers in the chorus line, and who was his particular protege, was Danny Kaye. If you see old movies of Danny Kaye in which he is dancing and singing, both of which he was tutored in by Dave, you can see in his movements and style some of the things that we think of when we think of Dave Harvey, when we remember Dave Harvey. That's why in the years after the war, I was always happy to see a Danny Kaye movie because of the of his style brought back memories. In Muntinlupa, at the end of our imprisonment, as I said earlier, we were about 400. On the day before our release, there were 48 of our fellow inmates that were executed by the Japanese, those with long sentences. And these people were taken out in small groups and executed in a mangrove grove in Alabang, behind Muntinlupa prison. We were 5 Americans, and we were supposed to be the last. Fortunately, because nightfall was falling, and they were afraid of guerrillas, we were not taken out. And the Japanese told us they would get us the next morning. Fortunately, in the course of the evening, the Japanese officer in charge, whom I suspect to have been a Catholic, was persuaded not to go through with the last execution. Instead, he and his men left on Monday afternoon, at which time the Filipino officials threw the prison open for us. That evening, we slept with the families of the prison officials, and a group of guerrillas led by one of our former co-prisoners who had escaped came and brought us the next day over to a road where the Manila South Road and the road to Cavite split in a place called Sapote. This, at that time, Zapote was occupied by American troops. To get there, we had to go through the hills behind Alabang, as there were still Japanese on the main highway. When we arrived in Zapote, it was already dark. There was a battery of guns, 75 millimeter artillery, banging away at Nichols Field. And that evening we slept in dugouts near the guns and eating for the first time in years American food, although of course it was such things as spam and bread and crackers. Still, it was heavenly. Early the next morning, the five of us were brought over to closer to Manila in Las Piñas, a few kilometers from Zapote, where General Eichelberger, the head of that army group, had put his headquarters in a large concrete residence belonging to a prominent Manila businessman. We were brought to the breakfast table of the general, and we were given what for us was a very sumptuous meal. Scrambled eggs, bacon, ham, bread, canned peaches, coffee and chocolate, and other goodies. When the general came and sat down with us, one of our companions, who was a retired U.S. Army sergeant from the 31st Infantry, instantly recognized the general, went up to him and said, and saluted, and said, "General, don't you remember me?" It turned out that in 1919, General Eichelberger had been a captain in the 31st Infantry, and our companion had been his platoon sergeant. And together were sent with the 31st Infantry to Siberia, which incidentally is a little-known military adventure of the U.S. as a means of preventing the spread of communism, and had served together there for over a year before returning to Manila. So it was a great reunion, and one that really warmed our hearts. After that, we were sent down to Nasugbu, where the airborne, the 11th Airborne Division had landed and very successfully and quickly made their way to the southern part of Manila. Here, we did very well. There were a lot of refugees from Manila, including people that I knew, especially those from the Ortigas, Zobel, and other well-known people who, in one way or other, were involved with the sugar central down there, and later made up the Ayala Group, which is such a successful business here. Here we had plenty to eat, and I was able again to fix radios for some of the soldiers and get my hand back in the game. After 3 weeks, we were able to get through to Santo Tomas, so I was, at that time, rejoined my family. The interesting thing in looking back at those years is the understanding that it has given me of human nature, of the resourcefulness of most people in times of great distress, and the importance of understanding people. With hindsight, it is easy now to look back on that period and see that the war between the United States and Japan was due to poor understanding on both sides. The American government did not research and try more to understand the Japanese before the war started, because certain decisions could have gone another way that would have avoided the conflict. The understanding of people has been very important to me. To know that in the worst extremes of adversity, there will be people who show their true nature, and others who fail. I can give 2 examples of that. People in the camp. One popular man in the camp was Lednicki. Lednicki was head of the Lepanto Mining Company in northern Luzon. He earned a lot of money, he lived well, but he had built up that company through hard work. When it came his time to be incarcerated in Santo Tomas, he continued his hard work for the camp's benefit. He became the head camp carpenter. He did not sit and tell others what to do, but he led by example. The camp carpenter was very essential, especially during the first year, because beds had to be constructed. Very few beds came into camp. There wasn't any beds in Santo Tomas. It was a school. People had to sleep on the floor in the beginning. But beds had to be built. All kinds of benches had to be built where people could eat. Various kinds of shelving and other simple furniture constructed for the children's nursery, for the fixing up of the converted dormitory to the hospital that was called this dormitory was called Santa Catalina. And Lednicki was always there in front. He went around the camp with hammers and other tools tucked into his belt, and he wore a big khaki apron with pockets in it, holding nails, screws, and other things. He was always in there working, and working hard for the benefit of his fellow prisoners, even though he had been a big shot. After the war, there were years when he was the highest income taxpayer in this country. Another example was a well-known president of the largest department store in this country. with branches in different parts of the islands. I won't mention his name, but he completely lost his reputation because as his camp job was assignment in the kitchen, he was caught stealing fish heads for his own use. So perhaps you can understand that stealing food from the mouths of starving internees was about as low as you could get. The events as a prisoner during the war, both in Santo Tomas and the other prisons, have greatly influenced my life. It has made me very fond of Filipinos. For many of them, in more than one way, risk their lives or gave me things that I needed, who had no obligation to me at all. And this, together with the help that fellow internees at one time or another extended to me, has made me always appreciative of this period. The fact that there are true good Samaritans in this world has made me always very loyal to those who helped me in later life. There is nothing better than this kind of help that one person can give to another. It is a true example of the biblical story of casting your bread upon the waters. So that in later years I have often done things for people I don't know and don't know much about, because they happen to be in some need. Whether they appreciate it or not, it has given me a deep, strong human feeling, and one of what can I say, not gratitude, but a feeling of having done something good if I can help others. This is a feeling that I did not appreciate before this period of imprisonment. When one reads stories of war prisoners and other times and other places, one can also read accounts like this, especially of those terrible times of the Jews in the Nazi prisons. You will find stories of true selflessness in helping others. I can appreciate these more than most of us because of my own experiences.